My spouse, Frederick Mitchell, has his ex-girlfriend back in the country, and she's making sure to brag about it to her friends. Meanwhile, Frederick secretly went to meet her, and as I viewed the intimate photos of them, my heart dropped. Without any hesitation, I signed the divorce papers. Everyone is eagerly waiting to see how I'll react to being abandoned. Darling, there's a class reunion this weekend, so I'll be home late, Frederick said as he removed his suit, rolled up his sleeves, and casually added, I was deeply involved in researching asset division for the divorce and didn't look up to respond. About 30 minutes later, a delicious aroma drifted from the kitchen, pulling me in. The table was full of mouth-watering dishes, and I couldn't resist gobbling them up, continuously praising Frederick's cooking. After 5 years of marriage, it was the first time Frederick had cooked. This is delicious. What made you decide to cook today? I asked with my mouth full. Frederick seemed a bit distracted, lowering his head to drink his soup, and muttered, It's nothing. I just haven't cooked in a while, so I wanted to practice. Now that the moon is back, it looks like a good man should have these skills. I feigned nonchalance and replied, Then practice your skills and do the dishes. Frederick frowned, hesitated for a second, and finally stood up to clear the table. Work has been busy lately, but don't worry about me. I'll do overtime if I need to, and I'll take you out for dinner when I can, he said. I crossed my legs and gazed at this serious-looking, handsome guy. If a man has someone else on his mind, he becomes your free assistant before the divorce, so don't expect any feelings from him. I'm Frederick's junior, 2 years younger than him, and I've always found him capable and good-looking. When he was about to graduate, I finally managed to win him over. The truth is, making good choices really matters, and it has made my life quite good. After working hard for a few years, he finally became a wealthy CEO. In the early days of his career, he handled the work outside, while I took care of the household. Now that Frederick has money and status, I've been behind the scenes. But on a few sleepless nights, I noticed him lying with his back to me, secretly browsing through his ex-girlfriend's WeChat moments, longing for the past. He seemed regretful, feeling that after achieving success, he was left with an ordinary partner. I also had my own regrets. I once believed that Frederick's only issue was financial, but now I realize his character isn't ideal either. At the class reunion on the weekend, Frederick went alone. I got dressed and made sure to put on makeup, planning to follow him. The moment I stepped into the private room, I noticed that Frederick's smile froze when he saw me unexpectedly. I looked around and spotted Isabella Thompson, the class beauty, looking as stunning as ever. Her fair face stood out in the crowd. Evelyn Parker, you're here too. It's been a long time, she said, recognizing me. Look at how well you're dressed now that Frederick's doing well. She continued, Yes, this bag must be worth tens of thousands, and this latest coat. Her classmates began complimenting her, but Frederick was once a poor student. After graduation, he worked tirelessly and seized a great opportunity, founding a game company. His wealth quickly grew, and now he's a well-known figure in the wealth list. As his wife, I've shared his struggle and accumulated my own wealth. I felt proud as my classmates praised me, straightening my back and greeting everyone with a smile. However, when the topic of marriage came up, Frederick's expression darkened, and he kept glancing at Isabella. I walked toward them, feeling helpless, and raised my voice deliberately. Oops, I'm late, and there's no space for my husband here. All attention shifted to us, and some classmates who knew about Frederick and Isabella exchanged complicated glances. Isabella, uncomfortable under the gaze, stood up to relinquish her seat. I managed to sit beside Frederick. Come on, old friend, let's toast. If you ever get rich, you must share it with your brothers. Everyone at the table clinked glasses with Frederick, while I could only smile occasionally and nod. Back in college, many classmates looked down on Frederick's family background, thinking he was indifferent to food, drink, or fun. They gossiped about him behind his back. Now the tables had turned, and the once overlooked Frederick had become the center of attention. Everyone pretended to be close, chatting about trivial things as though they were old friends. Hey, Isabella, come toast with Frederick. He's a celebrity at our school now. It's rare to see him. One classmate, already tipsy, didn't feel the awkwardness and continued urging her. Isabella took the glass, stood up shyly, and said, I don't drink, so I'll just have tea. Before clinking glasses with Frederick, everyone admired delicate beauties, and Isabella looked adorable in her white dress and shoes, her long straight hair adding to her simple yet elegant appearance. Through the glass wall, the contrast between us was stark. My designer clothes seemed flashy and intricate, while her natural beauty appeared so pure. I felt a pang of jealousy and finished the drink in front of me in one go. It tasted bitter, both in my mouth and in my heart. Frederick didn't notice my distress, but instead looked incredibly pleased with himself because of what Isabella had said. Suit yourself, whatever you like. Frederick stood up, grinning, and clinked glasses with Isabella, his face beaming. Isabella appeared slightly pleased with herself and gave me a sly look, showing off a smug grin. I had a little too much to drink, and my heart felt uneasy, so I raised my glass and clinked it with theirs. Time really does fly. Frederick and I have been married for 3 years now. I began to wonder how Isabella's marriage was progressing. Suddenly, her face turned pale, her lips pressed together, and she remained silent when I asked her. Back in college, she had left Frederick to follow a wealthy businessman and enjoyed a comfortable life. But I later heard that the businessman went bankrupt, struggled with debt, and their constant arguments led to a divorce. In comparison, Frederick's career is flourishing, which makes the past seem full of hardship. Before Isabella could respond, Frederick quickly stood up, interrupting the moment. Evelyn, Isabella just returned to China. Don't be distant with her, he said, pushing me aside and using his body to block me from Isabella. The force of his push caused me to fall hard into the chair, the pain making my heart ache. Frederick referred to me, his official wife, as Evelyn, while addressing Isabella as the White Moonlight. The classmates seated nearby exchanged looks, but said nothing. Not wanting to upset myself further, I turned and began serving myself more food. Evelyn, congratulations, you're now the envy of everyone. As the wife of a CEO, your life must be easy and luxurious. One of the older classmates, a little tipsy, said loudly. It's just luck and timing. I waved my hand modestly, replying, Frederick has always been a promising young man. He's done very well for himself. Evelyn, you better keep an eye on him, or he'll be surrounded by pretty girls in no time, Lee remarked, having had a bit too much to drink. Before I could respond, the others quickly intervened, telling him to stop. I too had drunk a little too much and rested my head in my hand, not wanting to say anything more. Everyone seemed to think my life was perfect now, and they began to feel both envious and resentful. Frederick and I had started our business from nothing, seeking support everywhere, but our old classmates had barely paid attention to us. People always only see the glamorous side of others. As the meal wound down, Isabella's friend, Hazel Wright, spoke up in front of everyone. Frederick, I heard you're now the president. Isabella's divorced, and her life's not going well. We were all classmates. Could you help her find a job? At this, the lively atmosphere suddenly turned quiet. Everyone at the table waited to see if Frederick would help, curious if he would offer assistance. A girl with short hair whispered, Frederick is Evelyn's husband now, and this has nothing to do with Isabella. If she wants a job, she should apply online. I couldn't help but laugh and gave the girl a thumbs up. Frederick seemed to be considering something, and the words were almost on the tip of his tongue. He glanced at me, almost as though seeking my approval. I intentionally ignored him, turning my head to signal that I didn't care. Frederick noticed this and lightly tapped the table, clearly frustrated. Isabella stood up, her eyes reddened, on the verge of tears, muttering, It's fine, I'll handle it. I don't want to trouble Frederick. I couldn't stand how Isabella was trying to please everyone, so I spoke up. Our company has strict policies. If you want to apply, you'll need to follow the process on our website. Frederick heard my refusal and looked at Isabella, who was nearly in tears. Without saying much, he simply waved his hand and said, We're all classmates. I'll take care of this. Some classmates wanted to intervene, but Isabella, now with a flushed face, choked out, Sorry, I'm interrupting. I have to go. Hazel W., watching as Isabella left, angrily pointed at me. Evelyn, we're all classmates. What's the harm in helping her? It's the least you can do. What's become of society? If you don't help, you're a bad person. If you don't help, you owe someone. I didn't care much for Hazel's rant, so I tugged at Frederick's sleeve. He pushed me away, his face darkened. Evelyn, we're classmates. Can't you show some tolerance in front of my friends? I suddenly felt incredibly alone. Later, Hazel kept blaming me, accusing me of being heartless and not valuing our old friendships. She acted as if, without my help, everyone's life would fall apart because of my petty nature. The atmosphere grew uncomfortable, and the party finally came to an end. At home, I lay on the big bed, enjoying a facial mask while absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone. The atmosphere felt tense. Frederick kept turning over next to me, glancing at me, but not saying a word. After a while, I couldn't hold it any longer, and, slightly annoyed, said, Just say what's on your mind. After a long silence, he finally spoke. The company needs someone right now. It's actually a good thing that Isabella is coming. The capital is so big. Why does she have to come to our company? I replied sarcastically. After thinking it over, I decided to relent. If she really needs a job, I can introduce her to a friend's company. Frederick snapped, "No way. Stay out of it. This is my decision. I control the company." His anger grew, and he turned off the lights, turning his back to me, refusing to speak. It was dark, and though we were close, I felt a deep sense of distance. After things settled at the company, I returned home and stopped worrying about the situation there. A few days later, I thought about sending Frederick a love lunch, but I was stopped by the receptionist. "Do you have an appointment?" The young woman at the front desk didn't recognize me and asked with a serious tone. As I was about to message Frederick, I noticed two familiar figures through the glass door. They were acting quite intimate. The man appeared very affectionate, while the woman seemed a bit shy. Isabella opened a beautiful lunchbox, and they chatted happily, even feeding each other. I set the lunchbox down with difficulty, trying to suppress the discomfort I was feeling, and turned to leave. On my way home, I found myself reflecting on the past. Back then, Frederick really liked Isabella, and during class, he would often gaze absent-mindedly at her back. I, on the other hand, sat behind them, watching Frederick. Isabella was truly a beautiful woman, with fair skin and a slim figure. She was not just Frederick's goddess, but also the object of admiration for most of the boys in our class. Is it true that the things we can't have are always the most unforgettable? Just as I was lost in these thoughts, my phone rang, and I saw a friend request from Isabella. She had clearly hesitated for a long time before sending it, and I finally called Frederick. "I went to the office this afternoon and brought you lunch," I said. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "We are old classmates, Evelyn. Isabella is only here as an assistant, so please don't make things difficult for her." Frederick was being very cautious, afraid I would hold a grudge against the woman in his heart. I looked up at the ceiling, listening to the ticking of the wall clock's second hand. Some people never get what they want, and it becomes a lifelong regret. I got the person I wanted, but soon realized they weren't as great as I thought. In the 5 years we've been together, I haven't even managed to make Isabella cry once. These last few hours before work, I thought about many possible outcomes. In the end, my wife always loses to the idealized person in my heart. Or perhaps she'll suddenly find the courage to return to her career, flourishing, leaving me behind, and I'll have to live on my own. When it comes to making money, I can't compare to Frederick. Isabella also faced some setbacks, and after understanding her current situation, she immediately turned back to relying on him. I looked around at the lavish decor, feeling a sense of reluctance. Just then, the door rang. Frederick finished work early today. I sat up slightly from the sofa and looked at him as he walked over to me, squatted down to meet my gaze, and said, "Evelyn, we need some time apart." I gave a bitter smile and asked, "Are we separating or divorcing?" He tried to embrace me, but I pushed him away with my hand, feeling annoyed. He was now so different from the energetic young man I remembered from university. Back then, he had been dedicated and deeply affectionate. "Look at this," I said, handing Frederick my phone and showing him Isabella's friend request. Frederick reached out to reject it, but I stopped him and clicked approve, then opened Isabella's moments. All the posts were about Frederick. One photo showed him carrying her luggage after her plane landed. Another showed him cooking for me when I had a cold and fever. I showed Frederick each photo, one by one. He went from being nervous at first to becoming more relaxed and composed. Finally, he couldn't hold back anymore and said, "Let's get a divorce, and I'll compensate you." I felt emotional. As the wife of a CEO, I hadn't even held the position for long before I was about to lose it. Just when I thought I could relax, I realized I was losing my financial support. "Evelyn, can we meet?" Isabella asked when I saw her sitting in a cafe. The dim lighting made her appear even more calm and elegant, like a beautiful painting. "There's no harm in being honest. My image really isn't as good as hers," she said first, her tone soft and slightly sad. "Evelyn, I think you should understand my situation. It's really quite tough. I know you need a job." I cleared my throat, seeing Isabella about to continue with her complaints, and quickly interrupted her. "We both have solid educations. We can find jobs anywhere. The world is huge, so why would you work at your ex-boyfriend's company? What were you thinking? Should I spell it out for you?" Seeing my response, Isabella stopped pretending and said directly, "Evelyn, I don't have many other options right now. You know how Frederick wooed me in the beginning." This was the first time I saw Isabella's true expression. It was completely different from her usual sweet, delicate, and sickly persona, which took me by surprise. The woman in front of me seemed like Snow White, but in the blink of an eye, she turned into the Wicked Queen. I thought to myself that if I continued, she would soon become the old witch. Isabella spoke condescendingly. "If you know what's good for you, you'll quit now, or you'll be pushed out eventually." I replied, "I don't want to get entangled with you. It's a complete nuisance. Even if I quit, I don't want to be the other woman. What a waste of time." My blunt response left Isabella stunned. After a few moments, she recovered, and her expression softened considerably. "If you walk away now, Frederick will give you some money out of respect for your past relationship," she said. The mention of money immediately caught my attention. "Joint property belongs to both of us. This isn't a division, but a fair split," I replied. At that moment, I knew that neither money nor people should be lost. I had consulted a lawyer earlier and studied the marriage laws closely. The money Frederick earned, why should he have to share it with you? Isabella, not pleased, pointed at me and shouted. This felt like she was claiming Frederick's wealth as if it had nothing to do with me, and it all belonged to her, which was incredibly frustrating. I didn't feel like arguing, thinking to myself that if things were divided equally, I would be rich. But before I could enjoy the thought for long, I heard a familiar voice say, "I haven't agreed to that yet." Somehow, Frederick had approached us, looking a bit flustered. As soon as Isabella saw him, her expression shifted. She softly pleaded, "Evelyn, it's all my fault. Frederick has nothing to do with it. It's me. I'm the one who still has feelings for him." Frederick ignored her pitiful words this time, and instead looked down and apologized to me. Both Isabella and I were taken aback. not understanding what was happening. Isabella was clearly surprised to see Frederick not even glance at her and glare at me in anger. I was just as confused and didn't know how to feel. Then Frederick suddenly said, "Isabella, I only like Evelyn. You should look for another job." Isabella froze at those words, and I couldn't help but wonder if something was wrong with Frederick. I had never seen him behave this way before. His usual attitude toward Isabella had always been affectionate, but now it seemed different. Something was off. I thought about leaving them to talk it over, but Frederick simply glanced at Isabella and then followed me like a shadow, showing no signs of wanting to go away. As we were leaving the cafe, I heard Isabella yell emotionally, "The favor you owe me isn't so easy to repay. What in the world is going on?" I shot Frederick a suspicious glance as soon as we got home. Frederick, eager to explain, began telling me about what had happened in his senior year. His grandfather had a sudden heart attack and didn't know where to turn for help. Luckily, one of Isabella's relatives was a heart surgeon and recommended a doctor. Frederick mentioned how grateful he was to Isabella for that. I couldn't believe how naive I had been. Frederick's feelings for Isabella had always been obvious, and he knew everything about her. I also liked Frederick a lot and had secretly watched him for a long time, sensing he had some unspoken feelings. In his heart, he probably saw himself as a frog, and Isabella as the unreachable swan. It wasn't until the swan went abroad that Frederick let go of his expectations. I realized that I was now in the same world as him, and at last I found my peace. But now everything had turned upside down. The swan had returned, and he had become the prince. Unfortunately, the prince was now married. What I didn't understand was why he suddenly didn't want a divorce. Later, Isabella chose to resign, and life quickly became much calmer, returning to normal. I tried to break up with Frederick a few times, but he refused each time. Frederick treated me very well, caring for me in every way, and I had never experienced this feeling before. While it made me happy, it also made me doubtful. Recently, I noticed my aunt hadn't visited, and I started to feel something was wrong. Could I be pregnant? After leaving the hospital, I took the test results, still confused. I felt my stomach, which still seemed flat, but the doctor told me there might be a little life inside. I was torn, uncertain whether to stay or leave. My lawyer had already prepared the divorce papers, and they had been sitting in my drawer. Today, I was about to call Frederick, but when I looked up, I saw him and Isabella walking out of the hospital together. Frederick had his arm around Isabella's shoulders. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do with my phone in hand. My emotions shifted from childlike surprise to confusion, and finally to an indescribable sadness. When Isabella returned to China, I had already planned to leave. But now, with the prospect of a new life, I felt incredibly reluctant. It was very windy outside, colder than when I arrived. I sat on the hospital steps, my mind blank, unsure of what to think. Several people passed by and asked if I needed help, but I just waved them off, hugged my knees, and buried my head in them. After a few deep breaths, I calmed myself and dialed Frederick's number. "Where are you?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause, and then he replied that he was in a meeting and wouldn't be home until later. Frederick was never good at lying, and this time his voice was different, not as calm as usual. I want to come home early for dinner tonight. I'm feeling a bit tired and want to rest. Just wake me up when you're done with dinner. I, too, was quite tired and just wanted to go back and sleep. When Frederick woke me up, it was already dark. I felt weak and couldn't muster any energy. Earlier, I had been on the verge of losing my temper, but now I just felt calm. On the table were stir-fried shrimp with egg whites, stir-fried broccoli with mushrooms, sweet and sour pork, tomato beef brisket, and a fruit platter. How many people could finish all that food? Frederick used these dishes to apologize, showing his greatest sincerity. Before we were married, we had agreed that if we fought, we would apologize with delicious food. However, after marriage, I had taken care of everything, never letting him into the kitchen. The food was great, but the waste was disappointing. I didn't say anything and sat quietly at the table. Are you angry? Maybe I've been too cold, Frederick asked, concerned, while continuing to serve me food. I'm actually pretty hungry this afternoon, he added. Frederick was about to speak, but I cut him off. You do need to explain, but not now. Let's talk after dinner, I said. What should have been a warm dinner scene now felt cold and distant. After we finished eating, Frederick carefully cleared the table, leaned over, and gently wrapped his arms around me. I rested my head on his shoulder, catching a faint scent of unfamiliar perfume, which made me feel a little disoriented. I closed my eyes, trying to find comfort. Honey, actually, this afternoon, Frederick started to explain again. Frederick, if we separate, will you really give me half of our assets? I asked suddenly. After a few seconds, Frederick looked at me in disbelief, confirming he had heard me correctly. He stared at me, utterly stunned. Don't say that. Aren't we doing well? His voice was soft in my ear, sounding slightly hoarse, as if he were still in pain. His expression was like that of a defeated cat, looking helpless. I held his face in my hands and looked at him seriously. Frederick, tell me the truth. Why don't you want a divorce? Frederick lowered his head, too afraid to meet my gaze, and held me tightly. It was so tight I could hardly breathe. I know you still have feelings for Isabella. There must be a reason, I said softly. Frederick, why don't you tell me the truth? I don't want to keep living like this. I had pursued Frederick because I believed he was sincere and wouldn't speak empty words. I didn't care about his background and was willing to build something with him from the ground up. But now, the honesty I once valued had vanished. Silence filled the air, making it hard for me to speak. I saw you and Isabella at the hospital. Isabella is pregnant, and she and her husband have been divorced for over a month. She wants to terminate the pregnancy, but her husband disagrees. There was some conflict at the hospital today, Frederick explained, going on to detail the situation. I'm just going over there to help out. The important thing is, it's a life. I couldn't refuse because of the kindness I owe her from the past. I placed my hand on my stomach, thinking deeply about the significance of life. I needed to consider this carefully. I wasn't ready to tell Frederick about my pregnancy yet, even though I felt he should know. Isabella had asked me to meet her again, and this time we agreed to meet downstairs at the company, where many people were coming and going. You really know how to pick a place. Aren't you afraid of what people might say about us here? I remarked. Looking at Isabella, I found myself increasingly annoyed. Her former beauty now seemed to radiate something much harsher. The early winter air was cold, making everyone shiver. I pulled my neck deeper into my coat. Isabella, however, wore only thin clothes, her skirt gently swaying in the wind, looking effortlessly stunning. She was like the pure, untouchable white moonlight, always enduring challenges, yet refusing to add another layer of clothing, creating the impression that she needed protection. It was nearly time for work, and more colleagues were returning from lunch. As they noticed Isabella, they greeted her politely. Just as I was about to speak, Isabella suddenly grabbed my sleeve with both hands and dropped to her knees. The employees scattered and watched quietly from a distance. A warning bell rang in my mind. What kind of moral manipulation is this? Just as Isabella was about to burst into tears, I also sat down on the ground. She was kneeling, and I was sitting, but when I looked closely, we were nearly in the same position. After collecting myself, I grabbed her hand and burst into tears. Isabella looked shocked, frozen in place. Seizing the moment, I said, "Isabella, please let Frederick go. You're still young, and this path is not an easy one." I intentionally raised my voice so everyone could hear, and the crowd around us gasped. Some even pulled out their phones to take pictures. A few eager employees explained the situation to those nearby who didn't know what was going on. My voice trembled as I spoke, growing more agitated. I covered my face with my hands and wiped away tears that weren't even there. Isabella snapped out of her shock and looked around, taking in the reactions of the people. She then realized I had figured things out. "Evelyn, I'm pregnant," she said, trying to use vague words to make me think I didn't know. I immediately shot back, "Isabella, your rich husband has been so kind to you, and now you're facing a temporary setback. How can you just abandon him like this? Do you have no conscience? You want to bring his child to Frederick to adopt? Is that fair to the child?" I tried to make my point as clearly as possible, raising my voice to ensure everyone could hear me. At that moment, Isabella's face twisted with shock. Her eyes were wide and her body stiffened, clearly not expecting me to react like this. Isabella was lost and bewildered when, before I could finish my sentence, I was suddenly pulled up, dusted off, and given a coat. Frederick stood beside me, and I spread my hands, explaining that I hadn't done anything. She was the one who had knelt and cried first. I adjusted my clothes, trying to look as though I had no part in what was happening. Frederick looked down at Isabella from above, her face soaked with tears and her nose red. "Leave my wife alone. That's my final word," he said firmly, ignoring Isabella's trembling hands, which reached out for help. He had no intention of assisting her. I glanced around at my colleagues, who were pretending to walk by, rushing back to the office. Eventually, Frederick carefully escorted me back to the office. I finally realized why he didn't want a divorce. The company had a new investor coming in and was preparing for an IPO. The marital status of the founder was a crucial factor in the evaluation. The examiner, smiling, asked about the state of our relationship, and the atmosphere grew tense. I could feel Frederick's muscles tighten with discomfort. In reality, we had already parted amicably and were only managing the aftermath. The examiner seemed slightly surprised, taken aback by the situation. Frederick kept explaining that it was just a minor argument between husband and wife, and that he was merely losing his temper. I watched as Frederick struggled to hide his panic, busy explaining the situation, and I stepped in to assist. We parted on good terms, and it won't affect the company. All the shares will go to Frederick. I'll just take the cash and leave without interfering with the business any further. The examiner left, still unsure, half believing the story. Frederick pulled me into his office, his face grim, veins slightly bulging in his hands. Evelyn, do you know how important this financing is? Do you know how much money we stand to make if the IPO goes through successfully? He gripped my shoulders tightly, his voice cold. I shook my head and looked at him. He resembled Isabella a lot, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but his anger made him even less pleasant to look at. For money, he could abandon Isabella, just as she had abandoned him for money. I looked at him with disappointment, thinking to myself that the two of them were actually well suited for each other. He was adamantly opposed to getting a divorce, and I was left with no choice but to say that if this continued, I would have to pursue legal action. A peaceful separation wouldn't affect the company much, but if things escalated, the damage would outweigh any benefits. Frederick pondered this for a long time, argued with me over property, and eventually signed the divorce papers. On the day of the divorce, the weather was pleasant, and as we left the Civil Affairs office, I felt a sense of relief, like I could finally breathe again. Frederick wanted to walk me out, but I declined. He suggested we have one last meal together, but I simply walked away. When Isabella found out that Frederick was single, she went to his company and caused a scene, which ultimately cost him the investment. Frederick stopped being as affectionate as he once was and exposed some of Isabella's affairs to his classmates, which deepened the rift between them. I had to be thankful that I had withdrawn when I did. Life has to restart sometimes, and I felt at peace as I counted the breakup fee in my bank account. Frederick's mindset wasn't entirely wrong. Money is important, but the amount was just right. A few years later, I saw Frederick again. He was still working hard to make money, but it seemed as though he had aged 10 years in those few years, and his face no longer held the same happiness. In the journey of life, we had come together once and then parted, never to cross paths again.